Hello, it's Shira Lazar coming to you from the Facebook Live studio at South by Southwest with Ray and Amy Kurzweil. Great to have you here right after your keynote.
Yeah.
You literally just jumped right in on the couch.
Yeah.
How did it go?
I thought it went great.
Yeah.
It's different for me from my usual because there's a back and forth, and
He actually has to share the stage with someone.
And you have your beautiful daughter here.
It's nice to be with.
I thought she was very eloquent.
It's nice to be with family on
And this is
stage.
the second time that you've done something like this. You did it. You said at Google.
Yeah,
before.
authors at Google.
And
So
why,
that was kind of our practice session.
And is this something you spoke about before? Like, oh, we should try this out, maybe.
Well, we've done a lot of creative collaborations.
Yeah, our first one, I was 14 years old.
14? I thought 13.
What were
I
these
think I was
collaborations?
14.
Well, when she was 14, this was 2001 TED. I turned myself into a young female rock singer using virtual reality technology of that era that we put together, and she was turned into Richard Saul Werman, who was the impresario of TED, as the backup dancer.
I was turned into 3 Richard Saul Wermans.
That's amazing. And back then, that was
very difficult back then.
Yeah, we had to wear these very heavy
Yeah, and
suits,
those magnetic
Velcro
sensors
suits.
picked up all our movement and then turned us into these avatars. The night before we went on, they changed some of the electronic equipment, and it didn't work. And we were up all night trying to get this to work, and we got it to work just before we went on. So.
And at that time, was it these ideas? Did people look at you like you were crazy? Like, oh, we're not going to actually use these things. VR.
Well, nobody had heard of VR. It was very futuristic. In fact, wouldn't really be a reality for another decade at least. But my theme was you can be someone else in virtual reality. So I picked someone that was somewhat different from myself, a young female rock star. So.
And I'm sure you were not embarrassed about that.
Not at all.
Well, she told me how a young female
I had to teach him how to be a young woman.
So how you move your hips,
not
move your
every-
hair, and everything.
Not every daughter has the pleasure of teaching her father how to be a young woman. Yeah.
And then a recent collaboration is I wrote a novel about a young girl, Danielle, and she was also my writing coach for fiction.
Dance coach and writing coach. We got all the bases covered.
That's so nice.
And the illustrator, too.
Wow. Yeah,
Yeah.
so you're an artist, creative. You obviously are a futurist, a technologist. Tell us about how those worlds come together.
Yeah. I mean, I think something that we've discovered in speaking together is that a lot of the common ground in our worlds has to do with identity and expanding your identity. So I mean, this like virtual stuff that he's interested in, and the idea of, you know, uploading your mind to the cloud and then spreading your consciousness across these different virtual bodies, which is something we might do in the future. That's actually what I do as a writer and what my friends do as writers, is we are already living in virtual worlds, creating, you know, fictional stories. Or even when you're writing, you know, I wrote a memoir, but I had to create this little avatar of myself because it's a graphic memoir, so I was drawing myself. And that's like this sort of splitting of my identity. And then when I, you know, draw other characters in my book, I have to kind of become them in different ways. And so I think that's the interesting common ground that we've touched on.
I mean, for me, writing is the ability to... I'm principally an inventor. Decided I would be an inventor when I was 5. Mm-hmm. And writing nonfiction gives me the opportunity to invent with the technologies of the future. I can't create something with the technologies of 2035, but I can invent them in my nonfiction books. In fiction, you're actually inventing another person and a whole... If you do a good job, you create somebody that people care about, even though she's fictional.
And then it feels like it's possible, even though it's not here yet.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, people often refer to fiction as like thought experiments, you know, like we write fictional stories. Like the novel that he wrote, the one that I helped him with, is this sort of thought experiment about what if we all had the kinds of capabilities that we might have one day. What kinds of problems could we solve?
Yeah, so Danielle is a very precocious young girl. She cures cancer at age 12. She brings democracy to China at age 14. And in the foreword, I say, you know, anybody can be a Danielle today. And we see young people start Google or Apple or Microsoft, and high school kids are doing remarkable things. Does anybody exist with the remarkable range of attributes that Danielle has? Well, perhaps not yet, but we are all going to become Danielles in 2045. And the novel is a thought experiment. What if there were one Danielle in the world? What impact would that have? and now realize that we're all going to become Danielles by 2045.
I love how you use a heroine. I love how you use a female, because I think that will help.
Yeah, well, our family had a lot of very influential women.
Yeah.
Amy's great-great-grandmother, my mother's mother's mother, started the first school in Europe in 1868 that provided higher education for girls. So if you were lucky enough to get an education in 1868 as a girl, it went through 9th grade. This went through 14th grade and became very influential on women's education. It's taken over by her daughter, my grandmother, who also became the first woman in Europe to get a PhD in chemistry. So we have, they were feminists without using that word, and they just naturally assumed that there's no reason why women can't accomplish things. And that was controversial in 1868. What's the point of educating a girl? It really was an issue she went around Europe lecturing on.
Well, I want to remind everyone watching on Facebook Live that we are with Ray and Amy Kurzweil. Just came off their keynote. Now, you referenced technology and telling stories about technology of 2035. Well, what does that actually look like?
Well,
this is where he goes he's like, okay, here it goes.
Tap into the script.
I've been consistent that by 2029, computers will achieve human levels of intelligence. They already can do things greater than humans in certain areas, like play Go and recognize images better than humans, but they'll have the wide range of human intelligence, and particularly really understand language at human levels by 2029. But my scenario for how we're going to use that is we're going to merge with it. And we're already doing that. I mean, who could do their work today without the brain extenders we already have? And these AI futurist movies have the artificial intelligence versus the humans, and they battle for control of the world. That's not realistic. We don't have one or two AIs in the world today. We have billions of them. And they are brain extenders.
They could create an army.
Well, but
that's
that's the usual depiction. What's actually happening is they are empowering all of us. They're making us smarter. They may not yet be inside our brains and bodies. That will happen by the 2030s. We'll connect our neocortex, the part of our brain where we do our thinking, to the cloud. And just as this computer on my belt makes itself smarter by connecting to the millions of computers in the cloud, so a girl in Africa with her smartphone can have intelligent access to more information than the President of the United States did 20 years ago, we will actually directly connect to the cloud, and not just to access services like search and translation, but to actually make ourselves smarter. And that's the primary application of artificial intelligence.
That also will cost money. So is that going to create a bigger divide between
rich
and poor?
No, it doesn't cost money. People say, oh, well, only the wealthy will have access to these technologies that Kurzweil talks about. And I say, yeah, like smartphones, where in fact you had to be wealthy 20 years ago to have a mobile phone. It didn't fit in your pocket. It was the size and weight of a brick. Didn't work very well. Now that they actually work well, do a million different things, extend our brains, there are 2 billion of them in the world. There'll be 5 billion, according to projections, in a few years. Everybody has them. They're ubiquitous in Africa already.
Yeah.
And that's because of a 50% deflation rate in information technology. You can get twice as much information technology as you could last year for the same price. That's a 1,000-fold expansion in a decade. So, I mean, this computer is actually 1 billion times more powerful per dollar than the computer I used when I was an undergraduate. So so only the wealthy can have these technologies at a point in time where they don't work. By the time they actually work well, there's billions of them, and they're extremely inexpensive. I mean, this is $1 trillion of computation circa 1965.
Is it a regular smartphone, or are you referencing something else that I don't see?
You've got just a regular smartphone.
It's like, is there something I don't know?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go for it.
I refer to my cell phone as like my external drive. Like it's like I use it for everything, and especially for my art. But I'm curious, Dad.
This is interesting. Wait,
I'm curious if like you think that going from the thing being my external drive to being my part of my internal drive, like, do you think that is going to be a difficult transition, or like
I don't think
how
it
will
makes
that
a difference
happen?
where it is. I mean, it'd be useful to put
But
it
I'm asking from like a human perspective.
It'll be useful to put it in our brains. We won't lose it that way.
Who's going to be the first person to do it?
Yeah, like you should be my co-host here. I love this. We're ganging up on you.
It'll be the 2030s, but I consider this part of my brain.
Yeah,
already.
already.
It's absolutely part of my thinking, and it's made me smarter.
Yeah.
It does, but there's still a barrier. Like I find sometimes when I put it down and I breathe, I flow better, and maybe information, like I'm not as in my head. So there's still I don't know.
There's a distance.
There's a distance.
Yeah.
So at what point? Yeah.
It's only a few inches.
Depends if I have my glasses on or not.
Yeah.
And they are starting to go inside our bodies and brains. I swallowed a computer a few weeks ago.
What?
Oh, yes.
Wait, what?
For like
It did a
endoscopy.
diagnostic test.
Yeah.
Oh, well, that. I mean, that's how these things start.
That's a good point, actually. Yeah. This is
We'll
something
have-
small happens, and then
Yeah, in 2030s, there'll be something you can take that goes in your brain and makes you remember things better. And people say, yeah, well, it just affects my memory, but then it'll do some other things.
Right.
These things, I mean, remember, these did very little, even 5 years ago. So these technologies creep up on us. They get really twice as powerful every year.
I find it interesting, yeah, because when something goes in your brain, I mean, that's intrusive. So it'll be interesting to see who that first person is who does that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Sometimes I ask my students if these ideas come up in my classroom. I've asked them, do you consider somebody who has a robotic arm a cyborg, or are they still them? And a lot of my students will say, of course not.
Yeah.
And you keep asking, well, what if what if all their limbs are robotic? Are they still them? Are they has their identity fundamentally changed? And they say, no, of course not. But it is like when we start talking about different parts of the brain, I think it's, people start to think, well, I don't know, at what point does
There are people
human
with
change
computers
its
in their brains
identity.
today, Parkinson's patients. The first ones were very primitive. Now they're pretty sophisticated. They connect in multiple places in the brain. And the latest generation allows you to download new software wirelessly to the computer inside your brain. So people say, okay, but that's for this particular disease. So that's how these things start. But these things creep up on us. They get more and more powerful. It's not like one day we wake up and suddenly we're connected to the cloud. It'll happen, in many steps, each of which seems benign, but then we look back and see how different the situation has
Are
become.
these like dinner conversations that you guys have, or do you ever have, do you
have
regular
these.
They are,
conversations?
yeah. I mean, especially in recent years, as I've started to get more interested in his ideas and the philosophical repercussions of these ideas and how they affect our identity and our relationships. Because it's something that I encounter as an artist and a writer. Is I think something I learned from him is you have to, if you're inventing something and creating something, there's like a certain amount of time it takes to create. And so then you have to think about, well, what is the future going to look like when you're done with this project? So you need to understand who your audience is. It's going to take me 5 years to write a book. So what is the world going to be engaged with in 5 years? And so as a writer, it takes a long time to write a book. You do think about those kinds of things, like what are we going to be talking about and confronting when I'm done with this project? Like, how can I make it relevant? Which doesn't mean that everything I write is about the future, of course. Actually,
Well, yeah,
my
Flying
book is
Couch.
about the past.
Let's talk about that quickly.
Yeah, so the book I just wrote, Flying Couch, is a graphic memoir about my mother's side of the family. So my mother and me and my grandmother. And I'm telling my grandmother's story. She's a Holocaust survivor from Warsaw, Poland. She's still alive. Some construction going on over there.
Yeah. Plates running around,
So I tell my grandmother's story about surviving the war, but I didn't just want to talk about her story. I wanted to talk about how her story was relevant to the present and the future, and how people who come from this history relate to this story, and how they can make some sense of it now.
And as immigration is a big issue, but we won't get into that.
Yeah. I mean, connecting to everyone in America came from somewhere else eventually, at some point.
Yeah.
Except for Native people. And, even they, if you keep going back and back, we're a migrating species. So, I thought that this story would be relevant with that lens, thinking about how we all move around and come from somewhere else. And so thinking about, how our histories are going to mean something to us in this future world where we are living in the kinds of experiences that my father predicts. That's something that I think about a lot, and so I have good source material.
Yeah, and what is your take on that?
One thing I've noticed, I mean, I've been writing nonfiction for decades. I wrote my first book in the 1980s, and it took 5 years, and not that much changed in 5 years. Now I write something, and 2 weeks later, the world has changed and shifted, and it no longer reads the same way. So my most influential book was The Singularity is Near, and I'm now writing The Singularity is Nearer. And as I write something, I come back 3 months later, and it's like this already reads like ancient history. So that's because of a phenomena which I write about, the law of accelerating returns, which is things are accelerating. They're getting faster and faster.
So is there, and I'll remind everyone, I was about to ask a question, but for everyone tuning in right now, I'm with Ray and Amy Kurzweil. And speaking of the singularity, it's been such a huge part of our conversation. Hopefully some people still don't know about it, but I feel like most people, you created a term, you've created an outlook on what the future looks like. Is there anything after the singularity or something else you're focused on?
Well, the term singularity has a history, which I won't go into, but the core of it is what I call the law of accelerating returns, which is that not everything and not every technology, but information technology doubles in power about every year. And exponential growth is very seductive. Our brains think linearly, and that's the primary difference between myself and my critics. We both look at the same world. They assume that progress will be linear. 30 steps gets you to 30. Yeah. 30 steps exponentially gets you to 1 billion. And that's not an idle speculation. This is already several billion times more powerful per dollar than the computer I used when I was an undergraduate. And we're going to do that again. So that's what I talk about. That ultimately leads to computers having human intelligence, putting them inside our brains, connecting to the cloud, expanding who we are. That's not just a future scenario.
I think it's here, basically.
Mm-hmm. It's here in part, and it's going to continue to accelerate. But it's remarkable. People have lived through this exponential change, and they still think they fall off the horse. They can't imagine it changing ever again. Mm. So they imagine 10 years from now it's going to be kind of like today, and they can't put together all the exponential changes we will experience.
Yeah. Are you thinking about anything outside of the singularity? Do you think about it? Is there something else?
Well, it's a very broad term because ultimately it's going to affect everything. We're going to be inhabiting.
It's going to be part of everything.
We're going to be inhabiting virtual and augmented reality. Augmented reality will be with us at all times. We're going to be smarter. We already have access to all of human knowledge, which itself is doubling every year, but we'll have even more intimate connection to it. We will be able to be smarter. We can expand our neocortex. I describe the neocortex as a hierarchy of pattern recognition modules, and at the height of the hierarchy is where humor resides and music, and we got that with these big foreheads 2 million years ago. Other primates aren't funny, and they may look funny.
Sometimes dogs are funny. Yeah. Haven't you seen a viral dog video?
But they're not intentionally funny. That's the.
So we're going to get more neocortex. We're going to be funnier. We're going to be better at music. We're going to be sexier. We're going to really exemplify all the attributes we value in humans to a greater degree.
I have two questions for both of you. One is, what are you excited about in all of this? What are you afraid about? What fears do you have in all of this?
Well, I've written a lot about promise versus peril. So the promise is fantastic. Vertical agriculture and 3D printing. We're going to be able to meet the physical needs of all of humanity at a very high level. As I mentioned, we're going to expand our minds, and we're going to exemplify these artistic qualities that we value. You can see the dangers in these AI futurist dystopian movies. I think they're a little unrealistic. As I mentioned, it's not going to be the AI versus the humans. We're going to merge with it. But still, technology has always been a double-edged sword. Fire kept us warm, cooked our food, but also burned down our houses. These future technologies also have their promise and peril. We just had a conference in Asilomar, how to keep artificial intelligence safe. I think we came up with good guidelines. 40 years ago, there was a similar conference to devise ethical guidelines to keep biotechnology safe. And that has actually worked so far.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean we can cross it off our worry list. But biotechnology is starting to cure disease. I think what's now a trickle will be a flood of applications of this in the next decade. But the dangers also get more pronounced. For example, the same technology we're using to reprogram biology away from cancer, away from disease, could also be deployed by a bioterrorist to reprogram a benign virus to be a more deadly.
Always the other side, right? We have to wrap. I know. I want your take. I know we have to wrap this up, but can we just? I want. Amy,
we can end with. Well, I mean, there's a lot that I'm excited about and afraid of.
And will there be a half people that want this, half people that don't, will like divide us?
I think it might. I think it will depend on the specific issue, you know. But I mean, I guess I'll just talk to end one thing that I think about a lot is what these technologies will do to memory. And I think we're already seeing that the way we remember is changing because we can preserve moments. So, I mean, this is an example. Like, we can preserve this moment forever, exactly as it happened. That's interesting. I am interested in how, like, when we know that we're being recorded, we act differently. So there's that interesting thing. But I'm excited as an artist and a writer to be able to record the past. That's incredibly useful for when you're writing, to have these accurate, you know, representations of what happened. But I do think that we remember incorrectly in our biological brains for particular reasons. So I am curious what it'll look like when we have so much of our history preserved.
Actually, check out what actually.
Yeah, I mean, there's a disturbing Black Mirror episode about this.
Oh,
which
yes,
I think
I watched. I was going to say, have you seen the Black? Has he seen it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one's a little
has he seen
exaggerated.
That one?
I don't
with
think
the
he's seen
points
that
and also
one.
the rewind and fast forward.
Yeah.
That's great.
It's a good one.
You should consult for that show.
Yeah.
Well, there's something called Life Bits where you record all of your life. Danielle, my heroine, and her sister have Life Bits, and they record every moment of their lives.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank
I know
you.
you need to continue on. Thanks for your time, Ray and Amy Kurzweil. And of course, stay tuned here for more from South by Southwest Live on Facebook.